The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not perfume. Not the lavender soap she'd used for as long as I could remember. Something underneath all of that, sweet and slightly sour, like fruit left out too long in a warm kitchen. I noticed it on a Tuesday in early March, when I leaned in to kiss her goodnight, and she turned her face just slightly to the side, offering her cheek instead of her lips. I didn't say anything. I told myself she was tired. That was my first mistake, not the last, not the worst, but the one that set everything else in motion. My name is Daniel. I'm 41 years old. I design load-bearing structures for commercial buildings, bridges, parking garages, the bones of things that are meant to hold weight without cracking. There's an irony in that I've thought about more than once since everything fell apart. I spent my career calculating how much stress a structure could absorb before failing. I never once applied that thinking to my own marriage. Claire and I had been together for 13 years and married for 11. We met at a friend's housewarming party in Columbus. She was standing near the window with a glass of red wine, laughing at something someone had said, and I remember thinking she looked like someone who had never once been uncertain about anything in her life. I was wrong about that too, as it turned out. But at 28, watching her from across a crowded living room, I believed it completely. We moved to Ashford 3 years into our marriage, when my firm opened a regional office and offered me a position I couldn't reasonably refuse. Claire had been freelancing as a graphic designer. She could work from anywhere, or so we told ourselves. She gave up her studio lease in Columbus, packed her equipment into the back of a rented van, and followed me to a town she'd never heard of with the quiet grace of someone who had made the decision before I even finished asking. Looking back, that might have been the first thing I got wrong. Not asking her. Assuming. Our son Marcus was born 2 years after we arrived. By the time he was 3, Claire had stopped taking new clients. She said it was easier to focus on him full-time while he was small. I agreed. I paid the bills. She managed the house, the school calendars, the pediatric appointments, the invisible architecture of our daily life. It worked, or it appeared to work, which I now understand is not the same thing at all. The smell on that Tuesday night, I filed it away. Registered it, labeled it nothing, and moved on. That's what I was good at. By April, the nothing had accumulated into something I couldn't ignore anymore. I work long hours. That's not an excuse, it's context. I leave the house by 7:15 and most evenings I'm not back until after 6. Marcus gets picked up from school at 3:30. Claire handled that without complaint. Dinner was usually on the table by the time I walked through the door, and for years that rhythm felt like evidence of something solid, a life that ran on trust and routine and quiet competence. But somewhere between February and April, the dinners started slipping. Not dramatically. A night here where the pasta was overcooked. A night there where she'd forgotten to defrost anything and we ended up ordering pizza, which Marcus's thought was wonderful and Claire apologized for twice. Small things. The kind of things that could mean anything or nothing. What I noticed more than the food was her eyes. Claire had always been sharp, quick to catch a joke, quicker to make one. She read people the way I read blueprints, efficiently, with an eye for structural weakness. But that spring, something in her gaze went soft. Not kind soft. Unfocused soft. Like a camera that had been adjusted to the wrong distance, and nobody had bothered to correct it. I asked her once, gently, if she was sleeping okay. "I'm fine," she said, without looking up from her phone. 3 words. Flat and final. The conversational equivalent of a door closing. I didn't push. I told myself she was adjusting to something, going through a phase, processing whatever private calculus women process when they're carrying more than they let on. I had learned, over 11 years, that Claire came to things on her own schedule, that pushing only made her go quieter. So I waited. I gave her space. I gave her too much of it, as it turned out. The bottles came later, but the drinking started earlier than the bottles. I know that now. What I knew then was that wine had always been part of our evenings. A glass with dinner, occasionally 2 on weekends. Unremarkable. Social. The kind of drinking that registers as civilized rather than concerning because it happens in kitchens and living rooms between people who know each other's names. The shift was gradual enough to be invisible. One glass became 1.5. 1.5 became the bottle finished before I got up from the table. I noticed the recycling bin filling faster than it used to, but I told myself we'd had people over recently, or that I was miscounting, or that it simply didn't matter. I was a man who calculated structural load for a living. I should have known, small stresses, consistently applied, eventually break things. The night I found the bottles under the sink, Marcus was already asleep. I was looking for a replacement filter for the faucet, one of those mundane tasks that exists only to remind you how ordinary life is right up until the moment it isn't. I opened the cabinet beneath the kitchen sink, moved the cleaning supplies aside, and found them. 4 empty wine bottles, laid on their sides behind the pipe, positioned with the deliberateness of something hidden rather than discarded. I crouched there on the kitchen floor for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked once, twice. She said she was fine? There's a particular quality to mornings in a house where something is wrong but hasn't been named yet. Everything looks the same. The light comes through the same windows at the same angle. The coffee maker runs through its cycle with the same hiss and gurgle. Your son eats cereal and asks about a video game level he's stuck on, and you answer him, and the answer is wrong because you're not really listening, but he doesn't notice because he's 8 and the cereal is more interesting than your attention. Claire moved through those mornings like a stage performer who had memorized the blocking but lost interest in the character. She made lunches. She signed permission slips. She smiled at Marcus with something that looked, from a distance, exactly like the smile I'd fallen in love with. Up close, it didn't reach her eyes. But you have to be paying attention to notice that, and I was paying attention to the wrong things, to deadlines, to invoices, to a bridge expansion in Merriam County that was 3 weeks behind schedule. I noticed the little things only in retrospect. The way she started choosing the far end of the couch in the evenings instead of sitting beside me. The way she stopped asking about my day, not all at once, but incrementally, one question fewer per week until the habit had quietly died. The way she'd take her phone to the bathroom and stay in there longer than she needed to. I told myself, she's introverted, she needs space, marriage isn't always closeness. What I was actually telling myself was, please don't let this be what I think it might be. One morning in early May, Marcus already on the bus, me grabbing my bag from the hook by the door, I turned to say goodbye and caught Claire standing in the kitchen with a coffee mug in both hands, staring out the window at the neighbor's fence. Not at anything in particular. Just staring. She didn't notice me watching. Claire. She turned. Sorry. Miles away. You okay? Tired. She smiled, the performing smile. Have a good day. I didn't push. I said I would. I left. Even now, I remember exactly how that felt, the decision to walk out the door instead of walk toward her. I dressed it up as respect for her privacy. But underneath that, if I'm honest, there was something else, a fear that if I asked the real question, I'd get the real answer, and I wasn't ready for it yet. Our neighbor, Patrice, mentioned something to me in passing that I didn't fully register until weeks later. She caught me in the driveway one Saturday morning while I was loading the car for a hardware run. A woman in her mid-60s, retired teacher, the kind of neighbor who notices things but phrases them carefully. How's Claire doing? She asked. The way she asked it, just slightly too casual, made something tighten briefly in my chest. She's good, I said. Keeping busy with Marcus. Patrice nodded slowly. I've seen her light on late. 2, 3 in the morning sometimes. The living room. She paused. Just wondered if everything was all right. She's always been a night owl, I said. Patrice looked at me for a moment in the way that people look at you when they know they know, that triangular silence of things unsaid, and then she smiled and said to give Claire her regards. I drove to the hardware store. I bought the faucet filter. I thought about Patrice's question for a mile, maybe 2, and then I filed it beside the lavender and sour smell and the soft, unfocused eyes and the bottles under the sink, and told myself the file wasn't full enough yet to open. The first time I came home and found Claire asleep on the couch at 4 in the afternoon, Marcus was sitting on the floor 3 feet away from her, watching cartoons with the volume turned low. He looked up when I came in. Something in his expression, careful, slightly too composed for an 8-year-old, made the breath go out of me. "She fell asleep," he said, as if reporting something that had happened before. "Yeah." I set my bag down quietly. "You hungry, bud?" "Kind of." I made him a sandwich. I let Claire sleep. When she woke up 40 minutes later, she looked disoriented for a moment, that blinking, surfacing confusion of someone pulled out of something deep, and then she saw me and arranged her face quickly. "I must have dozed off. Sorry." She stood, smoothed her shirt. "I'll start dinner." "It's fine," I said. "Marcus already ate." Something flickered across her face. Not guilt, exactly. Closer to the look of someone who has dropped something and is calculating whether anyone saw. "Okay," she said. That was all. "Okay." And then she went to the kitchen, and I heard the sound of a cabinet opening, the one beneath the sink, and then closing again. I started paying attention differently. Not the dramatic kind of paying attention. I wasn't checking her phone or following her to appointments. It was quieter than that. More like the way you listen to a building when you're trying to find where the stress is concentrating. You don't look for cracks. You listen for the sound that precedes them. I began tracking the recycling without meaning to. 4 wine bottles in a week, then 5. I started noticing the way she held her glass, not nervously, not guiltily, but with the practiced ease of someone for whom the act has become automatic. I noticed she had started buying wine separately from the regular grocery run, in quantities that didn't register as special occasion. She'd also started hiding the amount. That was the detail that got under my skin most. Not the drinking itself, the concealment. The fact that she would pour a glass in the kitchen before bringing it into the living room, so that what I saw was already the second glass. The way she would angle the bottle away from me when she refilled. The way she'd started keeping a bottle in the pantry behind the canned goods, which I discovered by accident when I reached past them for a can of soup. I didn't say anything about the pantry bottle. I put it back exactly where I found it. And I thought, she's building infrastructure for this. It's not new anymore. What I couldn't understand yet was why. I called her mother in June. Sandra lives in Cincinnati. Claire's parents divorced when Claire was 12, and her father had been largely absent since. Sandra and Claire spoke every week or two, or so I'd always assumed. When I called, I framed it casually, checking in, asking if she'd noticed anything different about Claire lately. There was a pause on Sandra's end that lasted long enough to mean something. "She told me she was adjusting," Sandra said carefully. "She said she'd been having a hard time finding her footing. Since she stopped working. She stopped working 3 years ago." "I know." Another pause. "Daniel, has she talked to you about what she's feeling?" "She says she's fine." Sandra was quiet again. In that quiet, I heard something I hadn't expected, not surprise, but recognition. "She doesn't like to burden people," Sandra said finally. "She never has. Even when she was little, she'd walk around with something eating at her for weeks before she'd say a word." She paused. "She used to call it being strong. I always thought it looked more like disappearing." I thanked her and hung up and sat in my parked car outside the office for a while. She'd been disappearing. And I'd called it giving her space. That realization didn't land lightly. Because underneath it was another one, sharper. I had been so careful not to push that I had effectively given her silence permission to grow. I thought I was being patient. I was actually being absent. I came home early one Thursday. A meeting had been cancelled, and for once I chose not to fill the gap with another task. It was 2:30. Marcus wouldn't be back until after 3. The house was quiet in the specific way that empty houses aren't. I found Claire in the bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with a glass of wine in her hand, not doing anything, not reading, not watching something on her phone. just sitting in the afternoon light with the glass, staring at the floor. She didn't hear me come in. When she looked up and saw me, the expression that crossed her face wasn't embarrassment. It was something worse, relief. Like she'd been caught and was glad of it. And then she rearranged it, smoothed it over, smiled. "You're home early. Meeting got cancelled." I leaned against the doorframe. "What are you doing?" She looked at the glass, then back at me. "Unwinding. It's 2:30, Claire." The smile didn't waver. "I know what time it is." We looked at each other for a long moment. I wanted to say a dozen things. I said one. "Are you okay? Really?" And she said what she always said. "I'm fine, Daniel." But her hand tightened around the glass. And her eyes, for just a fraction of a second, went somewhere else entirely. That was the moment I stopped believing her. I want to be careful about how I describe what came next, because gathering proof makes it sound strategic. It wasn't. It was more like watching a pattern emerge from noise, the way certain structures reveal their flaws not in a single visible crack but in the slow accumulation of stress marks that you can only see when you stop looking at the surface and start looking at the load. I found the credit card statement by accident. We shared a joint account for household expenses, but Claire also had a personal card, had always had one, and I'd never thought much about it. When an envelope came addressed to her, and she wasn't home, I set it on the kitchen counter. When it was still there, unopened, 3 days later, I opened it. The pattern in the charges told a story I hadn't known I was reading. Wine from an online retailer I didn't recognize, 3 orders in 2 months, each one larger than the last. A charge to a delivery service I'd never heard of. 3 separate purchases at a liquor store 15 minutes from our neighborhood on days when I would have assumed she was home. I calculated the total. Then I calculated what it implied about frequency. Then I sat down. There's a particular kind of shock that doesn't announce itself. No racing pulse, no dramatic intake of breath. Just a quiet internal settling, the sensation of something you'd suspected being confirmed, and the specific loneliness of having suspected it alone. I thought about Marcus on the living room floor with the cartoon volume turned low, watching his mother sleep. That detail, more than any number on a credit card statement, made me understand what I was actually dealing with. I suggested she see someone in early July. I tried to do it carefully. I waited for an evening when Marcus was at a sleepover, when it was just the 2 of us at the kitchen table, when I'd deliberately not had wine so that the imbalance was less visible. I said I was worried about her. I said I'd noticed she was struggling. I said it gently, the way you'd approach a person standing too close to an edge. She listened. And then she said, "I'm not an alcoholic, Daniel. I drink wine. Plenty of people drink wine." "I know," I said. "But not at 2:30 on a Thursday. Not in the bedroom by yourself." Something shifted in her expression. "So you've been watching me. I've been worried about you. That's different. Is it?" We went in circles. She didn't yell, Claire rarely yelled, but her voice took on a quality I'd heard before in buildings under load, controlled on the surface, something else entirely underneath. She said she would think about talking to someone. She didn't. Or if she did, she kept whatever she was thinking to herself. The red herring arrived in the form of a name, Greg. I found it in June, months before the credit card statement, a text notification that appeared on Claire's phone while it was charging on the kitchen counter, and I walked past at the wrong moment. Or the right one. Just a name and a fragment. "Greg, let me know how you're doing. Thinking of you?" For 2 weeks, I built an entire alternate explanation inside my head. Greg from her design program in Columbus. Greg from the neighborhood association. Greg who was a friend, a contact, a casual acquaintance sending a thoughtful check-in text. I spent those 2 weeks mentally constructing a story in which the drinking was secondary, in which Greg was the center of the problem, in which there was a person rather than a pattern at fault. I mentioned the name once, obliquely, and Claire said without hesitation, "Greg Mercer, he goes to Sandra's church. They ran into each other at Christmas." He and his wife just had a baby. She pulled the phone out and showed me the full conversation without me asking, and the evidence of innocent familiarity was so complete that it made me feel ashamed of the architecture I'd built. But here's what the Greg spiral cost me: 3 weeks of looking in the wrong direction. 3 weeks of focusing on a person when the real thing I should have been looking at was a pattern. The betrayal I feared was external, another person, a secret, something I could point to and confront. The truth was internal, and quieter, and much harder to name. I found the real evidence in the form of a journal. I wasn't looking for it. Claire had kept journals on and off for as long as I'd known her, spiral notebooks, mostly, left openly on her nightstand or tucked into her bag without particular concealment. I'd never read one. That was a boundary we maintained without ever discussing it, the way some couples manage their finances or divide their silences. This one was different. It was hidden, not dramatically, not professionally, but hidden, tucked between the mattress and the box spring on her side of the bed, discovered when I was changing the sheets on a Saturday morning while she and Marcus were at the grocery store. I held it for a moment before I opened it. I knew, the second I saw where it had been stored, that this was different from the others. And I knew, with a clarity I didn't want, that what I was about to read would not make things simpler. I was right about that. The entries were dated, irregular, sometimes a week apart, sometimes daily. They began in November of last year, which put the start almost 6 months before I'd consciously registered that something was wrong. She wrote about the house. About Marcus growing up and needing her differently. About waking up at 40 and realizing that the identity she'd built, designer, creative, someone with a specific visible skill, had been quietly folded away, and she didn't know when that had happened or how to unfold it again. She wrote about feeling invisible in her own life. She wrote, "Daniel doesn't notice. Or he does notice and doesn't know how to say anything. I'm not sure which one hurts more." And then later, "The wine helps. I know that sounds terrible. It just makes the edges softer for a while. I know I should stop. I will stop. I just need to get through this first." I read the last entry twice. She hadn't told me any of this. For months, she had been sitting inside this quiet collapse and telling me she was fine, and I had accepted it because accepting it was easier than opening the door to something I didn't know how to fix. She'd been reaching, not to Greg, not to another person, but to a bottle. And I had been close enough to notice and too afraid to reach back. I didn't put the journal back. I know that was the wrong call, strategically. Putting it back would have bought me more time, more information. But I'd sat with the wrong information for long enough. I left it on the kitchen table and waited. She came home with Marcus and 3 bags of groceries. I heard the door, the shuffle of bags being dropped, Marcus already talking about something he'd seen in the parking lot. Then Claire came into the kitchen alone, and she stopped. She looked at the journal on the table. She looked at me. "Marcus," I said, without taking my eyes off her, "can you go wash up? I need to talk to Mom for a minute." He read the room the way perceptive children do, quickly, without comment, and disappeared down the hall. Claire set her keys down slowly. "I wasn't looking for it," I said. "I was changing the sheets." She didn't argue about the invasion. I think she'd known somewhere that it was only a matter of time. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" I kept my voice level with effort. "Claire, you've been hiding bottles in the kitchen. You're drinking alone in the bedroom in the afternoon. You're spending money on delivery alcohol. And you wrote," I pressed one finger to the journal, "that you feel invisible in your own life. And you never said a word to me." She stood at the far end of the table with her arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way of someone who is holding themselves together through physical pressure. "You were busy," she said. "That's not—" I stopped. Started again. "I'm your husband. You can come to me when you're struggling. That's the whole point." "Is it?" Something sharpened in her voice. "Because for the last 3 years, Daniel, I've been here. In this house. Doing everything I gave up my career to do. And you come home and you eat and you watch something and you go to sleep and it starts again. I stopped being a person. I just became the person who manages things. The words landed with the particular weight of things that are true. I didn't want them to be true. But they were. Why didn't you tell me that? I asked. I tried to a few times. You'd agree, we'd have a nice weekend, and then Monday it went back to the same. She looked at the table. After a while I stopped trying. It seemed easier. Easier than talking to me. Easier than being disappointed again. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear Marcus in the hallway, not moving, probably listening in the way that children do when they know something important is happening. I need you to get help, I said. Professional help. Not because I'm angry. I'm not angry, Claire. I'm scared. For you and for Marcus. Her jaw tightened. I'm not. Don't say you're fine. My voice came out harder than I intended. Please. Don't say that one more time. She closed her mouth. We stood there in the specific silence of a marriage standing at a crossroads, both of us knowing it, neither of us moving yet. I'll think about it, she said. I need more than that. I know. She looked up. Her eyes were wet. I know you do. She agreed to see a therapist the following week. Her name was Dr. Yost, a referral from her GP. Claire went to the first appointment and came home quieter than she'd left, which I chose to read as meaningful rather than ominous. What I hadn't anticipated was what the therapy unearthed. 3 sessions in, Claire told me she wanted to go back to work. Not freelancing, she'd contacted a small design agency in Columbus about a remote position she'd seen listed. She'd already sent her portfolio. She hadn't told me because she wasn't sure what I'd say. I told her I thought it was a good idea. She seemed surprised. And the surprise hurt. The implication that she had expected resistance, that she had pre-built a version of me that would push back, that somewhere along the way I had become an obstacle in her imagination without realizing it. The drinking didn't stop overnight. That would have been too clean. What happened instead was a gradual reduction, tracked, reportedly, with Dr. Yost's support through methods I wasn't always privy to. There were nights when she slipped. Nights when I could smell the sour sweetness again and feel the old anger climb my chest. Nights when I'd lie awake next to her wondering if this was salvageable, or if I was holding on because I genuinely believed so, or because I was afraid of what letting go would mean for Marcus. I tried. That much is true. I tried to be present in the ways I hadn't been. I came home earlier. I asked different questions. I sat with her on the porch after Marcus was asleep and talked, not about logistics, not about calendars, but about the actual texture of her days. But something had calcified in me. I could see it, feel it, a protective layer that had grown up around the part of me that used to move toward her instinctively. The trust that had been so structural, so load-bearing in everything we'd built, had been compromised. And unlike a building, I couldn't replace the damaged section without tearing the rest down. In October, Claire was offered the position in Columbus. She told me at dinner, with Marcus between us, not strategic, I think, just the way timing works. She was animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her eyes were focused. Her hands moved when she talked. She looked like the woman I'd watched from across a room in Columbus 13 years ago. I felt 2 things simultaneously, genuine gladness for her, and a grief I hadn't expected. Because watching her come back to life, and she was coming back, slowly, unevenly, but coming, I understood something I'd been circling for months. The problem had never been that she was broken. The problem was that we had built a life together where she could disappear inside it, and I could be nearby and still be absent, and neither of us had noticed until the damage was deep enough to require hiding bottles behind plumbing. We'd stopped seeing each other. Clearly, honestly, as people rather than functions. I wasn't sure we could get that back. I told her in November. I waited until Marcus was at my sister's for the weekend, something I'd arranged quietly, in the way of a man who has made a decision and is managing its logistics. I sat Claire down in the living room where I'd found those first absent gazes, and I told her as honestly as I could. that I loved her. That I was proud of her for the work she'd done with Dr. Yost. That I could see her trying. And that I didn't think I could stay. She didn't yell. She didn't throw anything. She cried quietly in the way of someone who has been carrying the weight of a consequence they knew was coming. She asked if there was anything that would change my mind. I told her the truth. I had tried to forgive everything, the hiding, the disappearing, the years of I'm fine, the way Marcus had learned to turn the volume down without being asked. I had tried, and I had found that the trying itself had used up what was left. I still love you, I said. I don't know how to love you and stay at the same time. She nodded. She wiped her face. She looked out the window for a long moment. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. The divorce took 8 months. It was managed, as these things go, no courts, no battles, just two people distributing a life they built together into separate pieces with the assistance of a mediator who had clearly done these many times before. Marcus lives primarily with me, by his own preference, something he stated to the mediator with a directness that still breaks my heart a little when I think about it. He sees Claire every other weekend and one night a week, and their relationship is slowly rebuilding on different ground. She's sober now, genuinely, as far as I can tell, and working full-time, and living in an apartment in Columbus that she described to Marcus as smaller but mine. And I believe her when she says she's doing better. She called me in late summer, 8 months after we'd finalized everything. She said she was sorry. Not for the drinking specifically, but for the disappearing, for choosing silence over honesty for so long that by the time I saw the bottles, the distance had already become architectural. I told her I understood. And that I was sorry too, for the years of missing what was right in front of me. We didn't talk long. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said or absorbed. Marcus asked me once, a few weeks after we told him, he was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, not looking up, whether I thought things would have been different if we'd figured it out sooner. I thought about it honestly. I think we both should have asked harder questions earlier, I said. He considered this. Then, what kind of questions? The kind you already know the answer to but are scared to say out loud. He nodded slowly, with the gravity of an 8-year-old who is filing something away. I watched him go back to his homework and thought about all the questions I should have asked, and all the times Claire had answered fine and I had chosen to believe her because the alternative was a conversation I wasn't ready to have. The house is quieter now. Different quiet, not the watchful quiet of something wrong beneath the surface, but the ordinary quiet of a weekday evening, homework being done, dinner waiting, the refrigerator humming its constant minor chord. Some nights that feel like enough. What this story reveals, taken as a whole, isn't simply about alcohol, it's about the particular way two people can be physically present in a shared life while becoming genuinely invisible to each other. Claire's drinking was a symptom, not a cause. The cause was a silence that both of them participated in maintaining. She chose I'm fine as a shield, and he chose acceptance as a way to avoid confrontation. Neither was villainous. Both were human. And that combination, two people each protecting themselves from a difficult conversation, allowed something small and manageable to grow into something structural. What's harder to untangle is the role of identity erosion. Claire gave up a career, a city, a professional self, incrementally, always reasonably, each decision defensible in isolation. But accumulation has its own logic. By the time the wine became a pattern, she had lost not just her work but her sense of authorship over her own days. She drank because the alternative, naming the loss, asking for what she needed, risking the vulnerability of being seen wanting something, felt more frightening than the slow fade. That's not weakness. That's the kind of pride that collapses inward. Daniel's failure was different, not cruelty, not neglect exactly, but a kind of careful inattention. He gave space when he should have offered presence. He maintained peace when he should have asked questions. He was, by his own admission, good at building things that hold weight, and completely unprepared for the weight that had been accumulating in his own kitchen, behind his own sink, in his own wife's handwriting. The ending isn't a failure of love. It's the result of damage that was real, and change that came too late to rebuild what had been quietly demolished over years. Some structures, once compromised at the foundation, cannot simply be reinforced. They have to come down. What stays with me about this story is not the drinking itself, it's the journal entry. Daniel doesn't notice. Or he does notice and doesn't know how to say anything. I'm not sure which one hurts more. That line carries everything. Because she was right that he noticed. And she was right that he didn't say anything. And the truth is that both of those things, the noticing and the silence, were choices. Quiet ones. Well-intentioned ones. But choices. We talk a lot about the things that destroy relationships dramatically, the affairs, the betrayals, the explosive confrontations. We talk less about this, two people, each choosing the easier path every single day, until the easier path becomes the only one they know how to walk. How many of us have said I'm fine when we weren't? How many of us have accepted that answer because we were afraid of what the real one might require from us? The hardest questions aren't the ones we don't know to ask. They're the ones we already know, and choose not to.